Hey everyone, and welcome to Everyday Conversations, Faith Beyond Beliefs podcast. I am here with our guest today, Ted Kluck. Now, Ted is an award-winning journalist, the author of 25 books. I think it's probably more than 25 books now, and teaches journalism at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. Ted co-hosts the Happy Rant podcast and co-authored the new book, The Happy Rant, wandering to and fro through some things that don't matter all that much and a few that really do. That's quite a title.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird writing a book with three people.
Yeah.
And the book business is funny. Also, thank you for having me. We should do all the
No problem. Thank you for
early
coming on.
podcast pleasantries. I
How
don't
many
want to
books
skip over that.
how many books have you written?
Dude, I think it's like around 30, like
Okay.
including all the like ghostwriting ones and things of that nature. It's probably somewhere around 30. So it's not new anymore.
Yeah.
It hasn't been new for a long time. It's not especially even exciting anymore. And so you know kind of how the book business works in that if you can get a deal, you kind of go ahead and do it and then figure out what it's going to be. And that was kind of the deal with this. Like we didn't know what we were going to call it for a while. The publisher reached out and they said, "Hey, we want to do this and we want to see if what you do on the show would translate onto the page." And it ended up kind of being a fun deal, man. It was like kind of like it works on the show. Pipe and I did most of the work. Ronnie did a little bit, and there we go. So it was fun.
So for our listeners who may not be familiar with the Happy Rant podcast, can you give us the quick what's the story behind the podcast? How did
Yeah.
it start? What's the deal?
Yeah, dude. So this thing started like 8 years ago, and it was during a period in my life where I was mid publishing career. So I had done like a handful of secular market books. I had done a handful of Christian books, and I was convicted to get off social media. So I haven't been on any socials for like a decade. And so I wasn't doing any promo really. And the book business, they want you out there on social media doing promo work. I wasn't doing it. I was happy to be off social. But then these guys approached me. So Barnabas Piper, who's John Piper's kid, he reached out to me. He's like, "Hey, I got this podcast. We need a third guy." They had only been around for like 2 episodes. They were brand new. And I was like, that sounds fun. I've always loved radio. Always had kind of an affinity for that. And I was like, this is something I can show to my agent and to book publishers that like I'm out there doing some kind of promo that isn't social media. So I said yes. It's been fun, man. We've been taping every week for like 8 years. Just talking kind of about nothing. We're kind of like the Seinfeld of podcasts. We just talk about whatever. We never have guests on. And so Pipe now, he wasn't a pastor when we started, but he's a pastor. Ronnie was kind of just getting started in pastoral ministry. And I've never been a pastor. Like I'm a writer. And now I'm a college professor. I teach writing here at Union University. So that's kind of the deal, man. And it's grown. It hasn't been like this rocket ship trajectory, but it's grown. It's gotten pretty large. We've had sponsors for the past, I don't know, 5-6 years. So it's making money. And we do a couple live shows every year. Those are a good time. So and it's changed as we've gotten older. We started out as like I was right on the edge of young and full of promise still when we started, and now I'm like a middle-aged man, as we discussed in the intro.
Yeah.
Um, I'm doing misdirection up here on the face. I don't. Can they see our faces? Is this one of those
Yeah,
podcasts?
well, for the video, people who
Hmm.
watch the video, they'll be able to
Wow, I
see
didn't know that. See,
those
I would have
delightful
dressed nicer.
glasses.
I'm in
Oh,
this
you look
midway
great.
point between. Thank you. It's sweet of you to say, but
Yeah.
I'm in between teaching classes, and then right after this, I go and coach football. So I'm like half professor, half like football coach right now. So,
Well, you
um,
know what? That sounds like you're living the dream, man.
dude, I kind of am living the dream for me, quite
Coaching
frankly.
football, making
Yeah, I
podcasts,
can't
teaching people
complain.
to write.
Fixing the CFL with you, hopefully. So
Yeah, we
we'll
were
get it
talking
figured out.
earlier the problems of the CFL. It's
Mm.
it's yeah,
Thoughts and
it
prayers
happens to
their
the
their
best of
way.
us. That's right.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, what is the intersection between sports and writing? Because you've
Yeah,
written for ESPN before, you're a sports writer, and I
yeah.
feel like for a lot of people, it's like there's not a lot of people who both of those passions come together.
Yeah, man,
So, what's
it
your
was
story
a
behind that?
It's been a weird life in the sense that from age like 0 to age 20, all I cared about was football. I was a player. I went to college to play. In college, I ended up having a pretty serious leg injury. I broke the same leg twice
Mm.
and had a big surgery and the whole thing. And I thought for a while that I would be done. I thought it might be a wrap. And, kind of an existential low moment where you're asking the questions, is God in this? Is he good? I would say I had a faith back then, but it was pretty shaky. It really wasn't held up by good theology or really much knowledge. I really had bad athlete theology back then. I thought that if I was a good dude, that it was the Lord's job to like hook me up and make sure all my dreams came true. So um, when I got hurt, it was really kind of jading and disillusioning. But then met a girl, met a little lady, a little English theater hottie, who opened my eyes to writing and reading and kind of like gently let me know that there was a whole world out there that wasn't related to football, and found writing and really found joy in it and loved it and went for it, and all the grinding and all the work ethic and just being an animal that kind of got me through football. That really served me well in writing too, because I just went hard into it and kind of navigated through this space where I didn't want to cover sporting events. You know what I mean? I just didn't want to go to the arena and like write a recap or whatever. I was always interested in people and their stories and conflict and stuff like that. So managed to kind of carve out a career doing it. And for a while, I was kind of the only Christian who would write about sports. So I ended up getting ghostwriting gigs, because of that, and chances to write features and stuff. So the Lord's been kind, man. When I look at my life and my career, I think zero people at my college would have bet any amount of money on me becoming a writer. Like that would have not even been on the board. Like DraftKings wouldn't have even like had odds on it. So it's just been the Lord's kindness, and I've worked hard and he's kept giving me opportunities, and it's been a fun time, man. I enjoy it.
Yeah, this is sort of a side note, but what role do you think that narrative plays in sports? Because I
Yeah.
think when we think about particularly professional sports,
Yeah.
you are watching a game, but I think of the NFL often. It's like telling
Mhm.
you where this guy came from. He went to
Yeah.
college. There's maybe a mini documentary that plays during the ads or things like
Yeah.
that.
I think it humanizes the athletes. I think it provides some of that connective tissue between us and them, because really we're not like them. They are amazing at what they do. Like they're freaky, and the storytelling kind of provides a way to connect a little bit at times. I think it humanizes. Um, it's been a part of almost every sport, even like professional wrestling, which almost every dude has a weird like 3-year run with pro wrestling in like middle school. That's all storytelling, right? It's all narratives, and it's all kind of this soap opera that's fictional and intertwined. So I think we actually become more comfortable with that in sports than we think we are. And it was always the part that I enjoyed. I started one of my earliest sports writing gigs. I was writing about boxing, and boxers have great stories and they tend to be amazing storytellers. And of all the athletes, like if you're a great football player, say, and you come up through the major college system and the pros, you learn to talk without saying anything. So as a result, guys tend to be really boring. But boxers were really interesting because they didn't have the PR wonk in their ear. They hadn't learned the art of talking and not saying anything. So like it was very from the hip with those guys. So getting a chance to interview Evander Holyfield, Mike Tyson, some of these guys in their careers was fascinating.
Yeah, apparently Jamie Foxx is working on a new Mike Tyson film,
Dude,
and
yeah, there's always like rumors of narrative Tyson stuff. And
yeah,
there's one on Hulu right now. There's a Tyson show that it's not really doing it for me. In
yeah.
part because I know Mike doesn't like it. And if Mike doesn't like it, that inclines me to not like it. But I gotta give it some more reps. I gotta give it a chance.
What did you think of The Last Dance on Netflix? I'm assuming you watched it.
Dude, I adored it. I absolutely loved it. And I loved it because it unfolded, even though it was a documentary, it unfolded like a great feature story. You know what I mean? So it was like a great writer cut it together, in that the conflict was always hot throughout. They did amazing character stuff. The visual stuff was great. I actually use that in my magazine and feature writing class. So when I teach the feature, we always watch an episode or two of The Last Dance as a way to talk about pace and structure, how you handle chronology sometimes in a feature, and how you cut it together for like maximum heat and impact. I thought it was brilliant. And the other brilliant thing about it is that Jordan is just a 99th percentile charismatic person. Like, think about it. 99th percentile good looking, incredible at his job, like really a good talker. By all accounts, maybe a reprehensible human being, but it didn't matter. Like we all like I worshiped him growing up, and he's just a great TV athlete. And I don't know if Jordan in the social media age would have worked. Um, but Jordan in the analog pre-social media TV age was just unreal, dude. What a great superstar.
I think what I find fascinating about The Last Dance, I mean, there was the episode where he talked about how he started enforcing basically all these rules that the team need to stop partying, start working out. And so not only was he sort of carrying the team as an athlete himself,
Yeah.
but carrying the ambition of the team. So
Mm-hmm.
driving everybody so much harder, making the everybody on the team a better player.
Yeah.
Um, and so he's this guy filled with incredible ambition, but I couldn't help but notice the contrast of him now,
Mm-hmm.
where he seems just like catatonic in some ways, where it's
Yeah.
like he I think somebody with that much drive
Mm-hmm.
feeling the humanity of decline, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Knowing that he's past his prime just
Yeah.
sort of eats him up inside, you know?
Yeah.
And
He's a
there's
caged
a
animal.
fascinating pardon?
Yeah. He's like a caged animal,
Yeah.
like after you've done combat at that level, like after you've done that for so many years, like he had, everything else is boring, so you would really need Christ in that moment. You know what I mean? I
Mhm.
don't know how a person could navigate that moment and really losing your identity, losing the thing that you love the most, that you care about the most, which for Jordan was competing and winning. Like how do you keep living after that? And how do you not become catatonic or just a person who's throwing, I would think you would be in this moment where you're just throwing stimulation of any kind at your heart and trying to fill the void, which is all of us without Christ, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that was me without Christ, and maybe you and most people. You're trying to move the needle somehow emotionally, but um, he really needs Christ, I think, to have any kind of peace in his life.
Well, and I think he's one of a whole list of American celebrities who've really achieved and got everything that they ever wanted,
Hmm.
but they don't seem to have this lasting peace or happiness about it.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
what's fascinating for the culture is that there's still millions of people that want to follow in the same footsteps, thinking that they will
Yeah.
receive this, find their joy when they reach the top of the mountain. I mean, even
Hmm.
Tom Brady, I find this fascinating character.
Yeah.
It's like winning is becoming passe to him. Like just
Hmm.
so many Super Bowls,
Yeah. Yep.
and he's just kind of like, it just doesn't even seem like a big deal to him
Yeah.
anymore, and he
Yeah.
seems a little bit lost, even though he's
Right.
probably one of the greatest athletes in all of history,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and like anything, I mean, it wouldn't be a big deal after you've done it 7 times, and he's played in it, I think, 9 times, and he's played at the highest level of the sport for 20 some odd years. And I mean, guys like me, Ham and Eggers compared to Brady, like I look at that and I go, man, I would give like an appendage just to play 1 season in the NFL, and thinking that it would fulfill all these hopes and dreams and ambitions and stuff. But I think one of the best things about writing for a living at a fairly young age was being able to interview Jordan and Tyson and being around some of these guys and realizing that across the board, it doesn't fill the void. So
Hmm.
like putting the uniform on, running out in front of 100,000 people, playing in a Super Bowl or having a title fight or whatever, it doesn't do this cosmic emotional thing for you that you think it's going to do. And I mean, lay that pathology over publishing or the movie business or whatever thing it is that you're chasing. Our peace really has to come from somewhere else.
Yeah, I want to shift gears a little bit from sports to writing.
Yeah.
So you teach journalism, and
Hmm.
get the sense that journalism is at a weird space right now, especially in America. What do you see is the trajectory of journalism? Because I think,
Yeah.
people associate journalists with the media. The media is not trusted as
Hmm.
much. Culturally,
Yeah.
we've seen these declining rates of trust among the media, and
Hmm.
um, moving from an attitude towards journalism that they're sort of annoying or things like
Hmm.
that to sort of like this absolute vile or vitriol
Yeah.
towards journalists or those that work in the media. Like, what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, it's gross, man. The whole thing is really gross. The landscape is pretty gross. We talk about this stuff in class a lot, and by God's grace, my program, it's done well. So we've won a bunch of awards that we have no business winning as a school this small. But my program is more geared toward, honestly, creative nonfiction. We're doing the long form interview, we're doing the voicey kind of opinion piece. It's more the art side of journalism as opposed to the formula. And on the formulaic side, I think that the thing that's changed the most in the last 20 years is that whether you're working on whether you're working for, let's use Fox News as a paradigm and then CNN as a paradigm. So Fox News, you're on the right side of the aisle, CNN, you're on the left side. You're always doing somebody's bidding, right? And if I were working still for ESPN in 2022, I would be doing their bidding in a way that I didn't have to in 2002. Like in 2002, I was just writing on sports, but now ESPN is in the worldview business. And I don't know that I could write for them in 2022 because part of the calculus that you do as a writer is, can I live with having to do this entity's bidding, knowing that they're a mouthpiece for a certain set of ideas or a certain kind of worldview? And I think the result of it has been, to your point, a really cynical populace. So news has been intertwined with entertainment, which has been intertwined with outrage. Like the most entertaining thing right now, it seems like, is getting mad. So all those ideas are kind of intertwined in ways that seem really hard to extricate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if I can, I like what you said that ESPN is in the worldview business.
Hmm.
I look at the media here in Canada. So Canada was actually fairly conservative 40 or 50 years ago. Most
Hmm.
Canadians went to church. We've obviously had huge declines in the rates of
Sure.
Canadians going to church. And it really seems like some of the large media organizations in Canada see themselves as the hope for the future. So
Hmm.
they are proselytizing their worldview.
Yeah.
um, and there was an interview on CBC. I don't know if you're familiar with CBC, Canadian
Hmm.
Broadcasting Corporation's publicly funded
Hmm.
news organization here in Canada. And one of the journalists was talking about how 20 years ago, she was noticing all these websites were starting to pop up and get all this traffic, and
Hmm.
and they were sort of the new face of journalism, and
Hmm.
how deeply concerned she was about this,
Yeah.
because they didn't have the training or they didn't come from the establishment like the rest of them did. And
Hmm.
her biggest problem was that they hadn't gone to journalism school and learned the same ethics as they
Yeah.
had. And I
Yeah.
thought that was really fascinating. She wasn't really worried about the quality or anything like that, but that
Yeah.
these people hold a different set of ethics and beliefs. And
Hmm.
therefore, it's frightening that they're getting this sort of mainstream
Yeah.
appeal. And I think
Yeah.
that's continued on now with, of course, you got YouTube and all the
Hmm.
social media networks where you've had more and more people popping up and doing their own
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. It's
But
crazy. Like, I teach the ethics piece, and of course, we're a Christian university, so that's a big part of our approach. But it feels so quaint and so almost archaic or old fashioned compared to what you're actually seeing in the marketplace, right? So, for a lot of our students and for me, the ethical conversation is more like, where could I live with going to work?
yeah,
In light of the fact that in a lot of places now, I do have to check my ethics at the door, or I have to check my faith at the door, or whatever. It's gradations tougher out there, right? And there was a world in which, in the 90s, I romanticize the 90s or the past a lot, but like, news was an exercise in telling the story and then letting the reader kind of draw out their own conclusions from it. Whereas now, news is an exercise in like deciding what worldview you want to promote and kind of framing the story accordingly, which just feels uh, creepier, more commercial, less ethical all the way around. And yet we have students who still want to do it, and they want to do storytelling at a high level, and they want to write features, and they care about people. And I care about, I just look for magic in the storytelling, right? Like I love a great sentence. I love a great angle in a story. I love a well-written piece. And I think the appreciation for all that, it keeps us all going, you know?
Yeah, I want to follow two threads on that. But do you think there's
Mhm.
a little bit of an attitude of in the 90s, you had this moral relativism in America?
Mhm.
And you talked about some of these athletes, some of them got up to some pretty bad stuff. And
Mhm.
people didn't really care because it was this attitude of like, well, this is really bad or they're an athlete. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying that's good, but I'm saying we've flipped on the other side now where it seems like, you know, stations like CNN or whatever, they
Mhm.
have a very strict set of moral values and beliefs that they really want
Yeah.
to enforce, but at the
Yeah.
same time hold on to some relativism. And it's very jarring, I think, for people to figure out,
Yeah.
where's this coming from and how does this work?
Yeah. It's an incredibly complex moving target of like of ethics. And ironically, secular media is now doing the thing that for years they crapped all over Christian media for doing, which was we take a worldview that we want to promote and we reverse engineer a story to fit it. So this is the problem with Christian movies, right? This is why they kind of always suck. You take a worldview like, I don't know, prayer is good or porn is bad or whatever, and you reverse engineer characters and a storyline to like serve that ethic. And the result is almost always bad media. But now secular media is doing the same thing, right? And so part of the curriculum, even even just de facto, right? Part of the curriculum is even if you never write word one for publication, you're going to learn to be a more savvy consumer because you're going to learn what these entities are trying to do to you when they frame a story. And then you'll be less freaked out. You'll be hopefully less vitriolic, and you'll learn how to have some discourse that isn't just immediately going for the neck, you know? Um, so hopeful, aspirational, but it's hard to kind of see that happening out in the marketplace at times.
Yeah, I mean, I see the same thing happening in a lot of Hollywood movies now, where if you look at
Yeah.
the movies in the 90s and the 2000s, they asked these questions, and I think they were dangerous questions,
Hmm.
worldview questions, but it was subtle. It was
Hmm.
trying to draw you into a system of thinking that you
Yeah.
might not even realize you've adopted.
Hmm.
Whereas now it feels often like preaching,
Yeah.
and this really overt
Totally.
preaching. There is no subtlety left.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think it has to reach a breaking point at some point,
I
but
would
what that
think
is, I'm
so.
not totally sure.
Yeah. So in the 90s, I think to your previous question, if you were an athlete, you were just sort of allowed to be an athlete. And even Jordan had the famous quote, like, somebody wanted him to get political and support a Democratic candidate somewhere along the way. And Jordan said no. And they asked why. And he said, well, Republicans buy sneakers too. The subtext being, my highest value is I got to be able to sell Nikes to people. And if I alienate a whole group of potential Nike buyers, then that's bad for business and it's bad for me. So the subtext was just let me be a basketball player. And I think you're allowed to do that in the 90s in a way that you're not allowed to do it now. Every move you make, every statement you make is a referendum on your personhood and whether or not a fan base is allowed to like you. And I think it's harder to be charismatic in this moment. It would be harder to be a famous person. You see everybody kind of doffing the cap in Hollywood to certain worldviews, not even because they believe them, but just because they feel like they have to keep working. And it's crazy. You're probably more optimistic about all this than I am. Um, I'm a I tend to be more of a come Lord Jesus guy right now. Like I'm ready, man. And yet there have been generations of people saying the same thing, and here we are still. So learning how to navigate through it is kind of part of why we have conversations like this as believers. And as goofy as the book was at times, and our podcast is a humor podcast for the most part. I mean, we have laughs, but we address some of the more serious cultural things in the book because we all have that gear and we all kind of enjoy talking about it.
Yeah, can I just ask you a question as a professor? You're working
Yeah.
with a lot of college students, they're writing and everything
Hmm.
like that. Are you seeing a decline in the writing and reading ability amongst young people?
You know, we get really good students here. So
Yeah.
I don't know what everybody's experience is. I'll say this. I'll tell you what I am seeing a decline in, and then we'll get back to the writing thing. So I've been thinking about this a lot. Um, how old are you?
I'm 30. Oh man, I got to do some math here. I'm
Yeah.
33.
Just a kid. Yeah. Um, but you and I grew up probably in an era where we were watching a lot of television, and the television that we were watching, the shows almost always hung on dialogue, right? So take any 22-minute sitcom, chances are whatever the conflict is in 3 acts, it's getting resolved via people talking, right? So I sucked at talking to people when I was young, right? I was wildly introverted. I was a dork. I didn't get good at talking to people for a long, long time, but I watched a lot of these shows where people were talking. So I was getting reps in watching people dialogue. This generation, like the generation that's a college freshman now, they grew up by and large watching monologues. So they grew up watching YouTubers or like guys on TikTok or whatever. And they were these short, kind of bursty monologues. So I think I see this generation, you could give them a topic, you can wind them up, and you can let them monologue about something, and they're pretty good at it. But they tend to really struggle with this. So get them in the coffee shop having a conversation. It's kind of pain train. And I'm painting with the broadest of brushstrokes here. This isn't true of everybody, but it's an observable thing. And with the writing, I find that like step one is selling them on having an affection for good writing. So I show them good writers. You know, we read people who are the best at what they do, and I believe in that. And so I kind of get them excited about good writing and about the impact of good writing. And then I find that they pretty quickly can ramp up into doing it themselves. And that's hopeful, right? It's hopeful that there are kids out there who are still interested in storytelling and drawing out characters and telling a story that isn't just 185 characters about them, you know.
So when you guys looked at working on this new book, just switching
Yeah.
gears again here, what inspired the book? I mean, why did you guys want to write? I mean, the
Yeah.
publisher obviously contacted you and things like that,
Yeah.
but what was the sort of
I mean, we're all writers, and I think that was probably the entree or the hook for the podcast anyway. And every like white male of a certain age has a podcast now. Like wherever two or three Christian men are gathered, there's a podcast mic there, as
especially
the
after
scriptures
COVID?
say. Yeah, yeah. But so that's not unique. But I think the uniqueness in our show was that I was mid-career. I probably had done 15 books when I started doing the pod. Piper had done a couple books. Ronnie maybe had done one or two. So we were all kind of writers at different levels. And so we all like doing it, and we all like chopping it up about certain topics on the page, because on the page it works a little bit differently than it does in a podcast studio, right? So like via Skype or Zoom, like we're doing it now, we can be a little different on the page. We can finish a thought. We can go a little longer. We can have more style. I think the style piece for me as a writer is the piece that's always been the most attractive, right? Like I can be someone with style on the page in a way that I can't even be conversationally. And so that for me, that was the appeal. Also, there's always the appeal of like doing a project with your friends, which usually is better in theory than it is in reality. But I'm enough of a sucker. I'm enough of a kind of cockeyed optimist that I always get excited about doing a project with my friends.
Now, you had mentioned you guys have been doing the podcast since, do you say 2013?
Something like that. Yeah.
So it's almost been 10 years.
Yeah.
And you kind of build a community of people over time who are listening
Hmm.
to you, maybe interacting with you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what role do you think Christian podcasters play in this sort of
Yeah.
larger church body? I mean, I like how you mentioned
Yeah.
that every Christian has a podcast.
Yeah.
But what, because you mentioned that you moved away from social media.
Yeah.
but you found podcasting as something sort of in the digital internet realm
Yeah.
that you could get on board with.
Hmm.
But as Christians online, what do you think that looks like?
Yeah. I mean, for us, our role, the way I see it at least, and it'd be interesting to ask the other guys, but like to me, it's guys who we love Christ, we love the church, we love our wives, we love our families, obviously. So there are some like some non-negotiables, some doctrinal distinctives for us, but everything else is fair game to kind of be laughed at, and we should laugh at it, right? Like a lot of what we do as Christians is ridiculous. And so I think for a lot of people in our audience, it's become sort of a release valve, like for a certain kind of theologically minded guy, like you have to be so robotic all the time. And there are, quite frankly, just a lot of humorless people in the church who don't know how to laugh at themselves or others. Like I think it's become like a home for people who really love it. And we're not doing the like cool guy deconstruction. We're not mad at it, but like there are aspects of it that are funny and stupid. And I think our podcast has filled that space pretty nicely. And yet, on a more serious note, like the older I get, the more I want to make my life about making much of Christ. Like I'm bored of making much of myself. And early in my publishing career, to my shame, I was all too happy to make much of myself, right? It was very natural. But now, like opportunities to speak on a show like this or on our own show or whatever, and really make much of Christ, you can't do enough of that.
Yeah, I can't help but notice it. Like, so a lot of your listeners, they be in this sort of Christian subculture. Maybe they grew
Hmm.
up in the Christian subculture. I know that I did for sure.
Hmm.
Um, and it seems like the mainstream culture is changing very, very fast. And we're
Hmm.
sort of still in these Christian subcultures. They've changed a little bit, but
Yeah.
you know, how do when you're talking to your listeners
Hmm.
and even talking to your students, because they're doing journalism, they're
Yeah.
obviously interacting outside of just their Christian subculture. How are you
Hmm.
advising listeners and students in ways to interact with the larger culture?
Yeah. I mean, there's a thing that happens when you get a little older, and I don't know if this has happened for you yet. You fall out of love with the world, and I remember ages and decades and just eras in my life where I was really in love with the world. And it was really important for me to get the world to love me, or I thought it was important. You know, Now when I talk to my students about the culture, I want them to have a really robust life of the local church, right? Because as high as the ceiling is for all this electronic, interaction, and you can listen to a sermon by a world-class pastor every day if you want to, right? And there's some high ceiling on that. Like there's some upside to it that's pretty great. But at the end of the day, man, the thing that keeps me moored, the thing that keeps me anchored, it's my church, the kind of robust teaching that I get there. It's a love of scripture and prayer and some of these spiritual disciplines that have been spiritual disciplines for a long time that don't make for a sexy answer. You know what I mean? And in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was this spate of like cultural engagement books. Like we're going to go out and we're going to redeem the culture, whether it was in film or music or whatever, like we're going to make this super like thoughtful movie that's going to redeem the culture. And I used to think that was really sexy. Um, but having kids, dude, and settling down and realizing the best thing I can do for the culture probably is somehow, some way impart in my kids a love of the local church and a love for Christ. And if I can do that well, and if I can maybe do that for my students well, then I'll do more for the culture doing that than I will writing some angsty blog post for like, you know, I don't know, whatever
Relevant.
magazine. Yeah, Relevant magazine. Thank you. I was trying to land the joke. I had a CTE moment there, man. Too much football for Big T. But no, you were there to guide me through that joke, and I appreciate it.
I don't know where relevance at right now. I haven't
I have
checked
no
out any of their
idea, dude.
stuff
Yeah,
for
all
about a
the
decade,
caveats
but
apply, but
last time I checked in, it was a little angsty.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but maybe we all were back then.
Oh,
Um,
probably.
awesome. Well, Ted, thank you so much for coming on the show. I don't want to keep you too long. I just want to let our listeners know you can check out your podcast, The Happy Rant podcast, with your co-hosts, as well as the book, The Happy
Mhm.
Rant, Wandering to and Fro Through Some Things That Matter. Oh, I lost the some things that don't matter all that much, and a few things that really do. So,
Maybe a horrible title. Maybe that's on us, you know?
I mean, it's a long title,
It
but
is. It is.
I will say really quick, you guys, as I was researching for this interview, I listened to your podcast where they said, "How does it compare to Carl S. Truman's
Oh
The Rise and Triumph of the Modern
yeah.
Self?"
Dude, where are you
Which
at on
is
that book? Are you a Truman guy?
so I have it on hold at the library because I'm
Hmm.
really cheap. But there's like 11 other people in line, so I might have to just go out and buy it.
There
And
you go.
I checked out Charles Taylor, Sources of the Self. I don't know if you've
Hmm.
heard of this book
I've
before.
heard of it. I haven't read it.
Yeah, it was written in 1989. I'm
Hmm.
gonna be honest with you and say I did not read the whole thing because
Yeah.
it is like a tome. It is a
Yeah.
weapon,
Yeah.
and the dude writes a little dry,
Yeah.
but it was
Yeah.
good. There was so much good stuff in there,
Yeah.
um, and so I'm hoping that Carl Truman's book will be a little bit of an updated version. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
It's from a Christian perspective, whereas Charles Taylor, I don't know where he would describe himself. Like he ends
Yeah.
the book saying that he sees a lot of hope in the
Hmm.
Christian message,
Yeah.
but I don't know if he personally adopts that or where that went. He's
Interesting.
actually still alive and writing, so he's 90
Hmm.
years old. There's a
Interesting.
lot of info on on this book, but
Yeah.
and then Carl Truman said in another podcast that he had been contacted by the publisher to write a shorter version
Uh-huh.
of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self that would be like a 150 pager. And I was like,
Nice.
I could get more on board with that, but I'm gonna
Totally.
have to read it because I'm working on some curriculum right now for youth and young adults called the Identity Project, and
Hmm.
it started, our first version of it was really around gender and sexuality and these
Hmm.
topics, but I think we're realizing like we've got to go even deeper
Hmm.
when we want to talk about um, what Truman calls individual expressivism.
Hmm.
And I think, we're really asking these questions. How did evangelical Christianity get swept away by
Mm.
particularly the sexual ethics of the culture? But I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
other issues too, so
Yeah.
quickly.
Hmm.
And I think if you go back and what some of these guys have demonstrated in their research is that the ground was sort of fertile for these ideas a long time ago.
Hmm.
And it goes a lot deeper than just talking about sexual ethics. So I always
Yeah.
say this, like growing up as a kid going to youth group in the 90s and the early 2000s,
Hmm.
the youth pastor gets you all in a group and is like, don't have sex till you're married. And
Hmm.
when you do, it's going to be awesome. It's going to be
Yeah.
party
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
that was the sex talk, right?
Yeah. That's it.
Um, and I think it's so much deeper than that now,
Hmm.
and so much more complicated. But I also think as Christians, we have to start thinking about, we've been drinking the cultural Kool-Aid for a really long time. It's just
Yeah.
that the culture is changing so
Yeah.
rapidly. We're now kind of having this, whoa, what's going on
Yeah.
moment. And I think prioritizing ourselves and our
Hmm.
desires. I
Yeah.
was listening to an Anglican guy talk about how when you get baptized in the Anglican church, you have to denounce the world, the flesh, and the devil.
Mm.
And I
Mm.
thought that was really fascinating. I thought,
It
wow, we
is.
don't really have an equivalent of that in evangelical Christianity, but that's more of a
Yeah.
historical Orthodox Christianity. So
Sure. Yeah.
go
No.
ahead.
And if you really unpack that, like that's a large commitment, right? And I think what I love about Truman, he's saying a lot of the challenging things that like my tribe needs to hear. And he's kind of the only one doing it, and he's kind of the only one like living it out. And he's sort of like, hey, maybe living your entire life pastor in these mediated online environments where you're either arguing or chasing fame, maybe not great, maybe not an awesome way to spend your time as a pastor. And pastors, even like quote unquote solid guys that I know, are like, oh yeah, that's really interesting, Carl Truman, like hold my beer while I go back to tweeting about myself. And it's kind of a strange dynamic where he's saying things that a lot of people are agreeing with, but then people's actions aren't changing. Um, And I just think, to your point, it's a very good point. Like, the culture has its hooks in really deep right now. And I think Truman is trying to like peel back the layers of that and maybe challenge us to extricate ourselves a little bit. But it's slow going, I guess.
Well, I like what you talked about moving away from social media, way back in 2012 or
Hmm.
2013, when really a lot of people were first getting onto social media.
Hmm.
And I wrote a short book for my graduating project on technology and developing a Christian perspective on really
Yeah.
consumer technology and social media.
Yeah.
And I think we underestimate how seductive social media is. And
Yeah.
this idea, I think, especially for pastors,
Hmm.
people start to listen to you and they start to
Hmm.
read what you tweet.
Yeah.
And knowing that at any moment you could just go type out some tweet and get a bunch of reactions, get a bunch of comments, maybe even
Yeah.
stir up some controversy,
Hmm.
it's incredibly seductive, and it changes the way we think about
Absolutely.
ourselves and our ministry.
Hmm.
And we don't, I mean, I notice this about myself all the time, but how addicted I am to these technology, even as somebody who's trying to
Yeah,
spend
you're
less and
aware of
less
it.
time on
Right. Right.
technology, and how much of a pull
Hmm.
it has over us. So,
Hmm.
it was interesting. I was listening, you were on your latest podcast talking to Barnabas Piper, and he was talking about how Twitter is where he gets all his inspiration from.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know if it was you or the other co-host that said
Hmm.
that's sad and troubling,
It was me. Yeah. I think
Uh,
Twitter is such a toilet. It's awful. Like, and yet so many pastors spend so much of their time there. It's odd to me. And I say this as a like as non-judgmentally as possible, because I got off it because I couldn't be on it without sinning. Right. I couldn't be on it without sinning all the time. And I'm just like, this is a fairly easy thing to cut out of my life. So why wouldn't I flee it? You know what I mean? Why wouldn't I cut that part of my life out? And it's been good. Like, there's been more joy in my life, I think, as a result, and less sin, which is what I need in all realms of my life.
I mean, social media is this fascinating thing where nobody spends a half an hour scrolling through Twitter or Instagram and feels good
Hmm.
afterwards. Nobody's like, wow,
Yeah, you're right.
that was the
Oh my
best
gosh, that
way
was great. That
to
was
spend my
nourishing.
time.
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody feels like that, even
Right.
secular people, but I think especially a lot of Christian people, we feel
Hmm.
even more. And yet we keep going back to it. It's the
Hmm.
saltwater well that we just keep
Hmm.
drinking from and getting more
Hmm.
thirsty. And
Hmm.
I think as Christians, we need to start having these really serious conversations about how is this impacting us
Yeah.
on so many different levels,
Hmm.
and what does healthy interaction look like with some of this technology. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right. Truman's got so many great things to say to us, but I
Hmm.
think evangelical Christianity, if I can use that sort of
Hmm.
buzzword, has
Hmm.
a lot of, we got to do some renovations.
Yeah.
We got a lot of things going wrong in the house that
Yeah.
we got to work on. And so
Yeah.
I'm hoping that coming out of COVID and coming out of the 2016 and 2020
Hmm.
elections, we can see the church be strengthened, because I know a
Yeah.
lot of people have left, but hopefully the ones that stay, remain strong and create
Yeah.
disciples and all that kind of good stuff. But it
Hmm.
is a really weird time, and I think, we don't really know. There's no playbook for what
Yeah.
we're in right now.
Yeah. 100%. You know what's interesting, and I'll leave you with this. My students are fascinated by stories that I tell about a pre-internet world. Like, it's funny because I always assumed college students were really cool and interesting, and then I started teaching, and so, like, early in my career, I would come into the classroom and be like, you guys, tell me a story. Like, you're in college, you're in the prime of your life, you're having fun. And before long, it turned into them just being like, tell us stories about what life was like before the internet. And like, they're really drawn in by, how did you meet your wife, like, before texting, and what did that look like, and what did having friends in college look like. And I guess I'm encouraged that there's a fascination with a more kind of analog real life that isn't just sort of curated online. And as long as people are interested in that, I guess there's hope that one day we might try to reclaim that again. You know what I mean?
they know that it is everything in their lives. It shapes everything
Mm-hmm.
in their lives, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
almost the air they're breathing. And they also
Yeah.
know, I think, that there's something missing, that there's something
Yeah.
wrong, and I think they long for something different.
They
You
do.
know, they're 20 years old, they've been on Instagram for 10 years or whatever, and they're almost
Yeah.
burned out by it.
Yeah.
And so it's this really fascinating time where I
Mm-hmm.
think, like, my parents' generation, they're just getting on. I mean,
Sure.
they've been on for 5 or 10 years, right? But
Yeah.
they're just eating it up.
Yeah.
Uh, but they lived all that life before offline, right?
Yeah. That's
I mean, my
right, man.
parents, they both grew up, they didn't even have TV. They
Yeah.
just read books. And
Yep.
so
Yep.
it's crazy to think of going from that to where they're at now.
Dude,
Uh,
right. And the mind-blowing thing about college students today is that they've been on Instagram for 10 years, but their parents have too. So like they don't know their dads. And these are kids from quote unquote good families, right? With two parents in the home or whatever. They come home, dad's buried in his Twitter or Facebook life. Mom is too, maybe. So they've like lived in the house with these people who they really don't know. And there's deep dissatisfaction in that. I think it's really fascinating.
yeah,
Yeah,
kind of a sad note to end on, but
I know, dude. A real downer. I really have a way of ending a podcast, right? Like, let me
no,
leave
it's
you with
good though.
something deeply depressing, and then just we'll see ourselves out.
Yeah, so it's sadder than the trajectory of the CFL right now.
Oh
Uh,
man.
so
Oh, don't bring that back to mind. We got to think happier thoughts. Think
yeah,
about
well, thank you
Rocket
so much.
Ismail playing for the Toronto Argos in the early '90s. That was pretty cool.
There you
Remember
go.
that, dude?
Dude,
John
I,
Candy owned the Argos.
I wasn't watching back then, no,
Yeah,
but I'm sure some of our listeners will.
yeah.
So
I hope so.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ted, for joining us. I just want to remind our listeners that Faith Beyond Belief is a listener supported ministry. So you can go to our website, faithbeyondbelief.ca, find all of our resources, and find ways that you can partner with us. And so we want to share those resources with you. And once again, thank you, Ted. Check out the Happy Rant podcast as well as their new book. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.